Hi, Allie. Is that how you say your name?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. I was a little confused. So, okay. I was trying to figure out what's happening.
And so, would you like me to run the closed captioner for you, or do you think it won't be needed until they move the sessions to YouTube?
I think we'll probably, yeah, wait until the sessions are moved to YouTube.
Okay.
Hmm. And do you know when that will be?
I'm not 100% sure, but
Okay.
when we have our meeting today, I'll remind them to let everybody know.
Okay. Are other participants here yet? I guess I can't really tell. I'm new to Hop In, so it's a new platform for me to.
It looks like there's two other people here besides the two of us.
Okay. Hi. Because it looks a little different from the backstage part that I used. But I should still be able to share my screen and everything. Okay.
Yep, and I'll get off of here too.
Oh no, you're fine. Is there anything else I need to know or do? Because we're still
Um,
45 minutes, right? And then just leaving time for.
right. I have a short thing I'm supposed to read, but that only takes like a minute, like
Okay.
30 seconds. I don't know.
And then are participants able to join? And like if they have a question or like to share, they're able to do that.
Yep, they can join the chat. They can use the Q&A tab, or they can request to come on the screen. We can have up to 5 people on the screen for the session
Okay.
if we need to. And then, oh, it says up to 20.
Yeah, because I know for the first part of the discussion, I'd like to, for the first part of the presentation, I'd like to invite people up if they want to share
Okay.
different experiences. So I just wanted to know logistically how to do that.
Hang on, let me refresh my screen because it still says up to 5 for me, but maybe they changed it and it's not. Hang on. I refreshed my screen and now it does say up to 20. So,
Okay.
yeah. Okay, great.
So I'm gonna try to let me pull up my presentation, then I'm gonna share my screen. Mm, this is the button that I use for that.
Hey, hey.
Hello.
I just wanted to come on and clear it up. Yeah, so it's a non-moderated session, so folks can like pop in and leave as they please. I didn't know if you all knew that because as moderators, it looks the same as a non-moderated session. So
All right.
just wanted to let you know. And I'm gonna pop out. Bye.
Thank you. So to make sure that I understand, because it's non-moderated, they can just join whenever.
Oh, looks like it.
Okay. Alrighty. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And I'm not quite sure if people are coming from another session before or not. So I can maybe wait another minute or so to see. ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. As you're coming in, we'll get started in here in just a minute or two. I'm going to pull it on the chat so that I can see. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hope you all are doing well. So I'm going to go ahead and hop in because I don't want us to lose too much time. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Takita Bankhead. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm super excited to be rejoining the group to present on a presentation about something that I'm sure is impacting most, if not all of us, strategies for mitigating burnout. I will say for this session, at first, I was going to go more of a route of trying to kind of prep us and think about like very tactical ways for addressing burnout. But I also I'll put you in on a little bit of a secret. I really love smaller groups and I love to be able to have discussion. And I think that some of our greatest learning comes from being able to share with each other, like just kind of what's happening, what we're experiencing and what we're finding, things that are helpful for us. So I really do want this to be more of a group conversation. So if you're comfortable and willing, there may be moments where I invite you up to share your experiences. Please, please, please feel free, because I do want it to be more of a conversation as opposed to me talking at you. I'm still getting used to the virtual world because I'm so used to being able to feel the people I'm in the room with and being able to kind of get a sense and feel your energy. So I'm hoping that we can at least mimic some of that today with our workshop. So, oh, I'm sorry. Did someone say something? Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and move through. So just a little bit, our community agreements, I always use very similar ones. Please know that honesty, vulnerability, and accountability are equally welcomed and respected. Feel free to share your experiences at any time through the presentation. If there's something you agree with or something that you feel like really resonates with you, please feel free to share. And then also just to challenge yourself to reflect before reacting. So for this first activity, I think that we are at a point, particularly if you all are experiencing any similar times on your semester, on your campuses, where the semester feels absolutely nonstop. And in any other November and in any other part of closing fall, whether you're on a semester, a quarter, trimester system, I think people are in different systems, but we are at a point in the semester where no matter what work you do, you just do not feel like you can catch up. You do not feel like you have a moment to get away. You do not feel like you're ever going to really just be able to kind of breathe until the students are out. And I remember, at least for housing, a lot of times we are not able to really get that moment until after we close down our residence halls and after we have cleared out all of our conduct cases and gotten everything out of our queue to be able to finally feel like we can breathe. I think when we're thinking about the sense of burnout, part of it is really challenging ourselves to have a mindset to think beyond, okay, if I keep putting my burnout at this designated time period that will happen at a later moment, how am I thinking about what that burnout is doing to me in the moment? And how is that contributing and pushing me further along the spectrum of burnout that might be even harder to come back from? So that's one of those things that when we're thinking about burnout, thinking about the mindset, getting an accurate assessment of where we are mentally, spiritually, emotionally, physically, we have to not only think about, oh, when I get there, but where am I now? So in this activity, I'm going to kind of just give some statements, very general. I tried to keep them fairly broad. And if you feel like this is something that kicks up a reaction in you, that you're like, I felt this at one moment, or I'm feeling this now, I'd love for you to share just a little bit more about that. So for each statement, I'll invite a couple of people on the screen who might be willing to share. and then we'll kind of talk through. And if you are agreeing with anything that people who are on the stage are sharing, please feel free to let them know in the chat that they are not alone. So the point of this is to let us know that we're all at a certain point in our careers, in our day, in our semesters, and we want to make sure that we're finding community and where we what we're feeling in this moment. So our first statement: I often feel that I'm being asked to be everything to everyone, but I do not always feel the same level of support in return. So, is there anyone who can resonate with this sentiment that would like to share more? And I'm not quite sure how in the in this session that people are able to ask. So, is there anyone that would like to share, that would like to join, or either unmute and share? You don't necessarily have to come up.
Okay.
Mike, we're welcoming you. Mike, come on. Thank you.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. Sorry, it took a moment to click.
No problem. We're figuring it out.
I will say so. I think I'm lucky enough to feel the same level of support in return from my supervisor, which I'm sure that a lot of folks might have different experiences. But so my current position, I'm in an upper entry, lower mid-level role, where I coordinate a lot between an academic partner and a dining partner and a facilities partner, as well as oversee a staff and a building of 1,000 students. And so I think especially from our partners who don't exist outside, whose existence is outside of that housing world, that crisis management world and roles, and just the everyday needs of the students who report up through RAs and CDs to me. Sometimes that's sometimes it's difficult to reconcile, like, hey, like we just responded to this very heavy mental health incident, and they just continue to come this semester. And so I I'm having difficulty explaining to you why that classroom being unlocked is not an emergency right now, and that I don't know how to explain that to you, but I also understand that that's not where you're at in the moment, but I'm going to need you to support me by not needing that right now, if that makes sense.
I need you to not need me. I think that that's a very relatable feeling. And thank you so much for sharing, Mike. I think that one of the most common things that I hear from professionals that are dealing with this is that sometimes, even in our, I won't even always call it burnout, but sometimes even just the exhaustion, we we don't have the capacity to explain how these things are contributing. We like, I can't make you understand this right now. I just need you to trust me, and I need you to to understand that there's a level of things that we're dealing with, that if you just trust me and listen and hear what I'm saying, it would actually help. So thank you. Super relatable.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to share? And this also doesn't have to necessarily be a work related thing. I think work is super helpful to bring into the space, but doesn't necessarily have to be work. I'm seeing some great things in the chat. I'm going to just read some of those out just for folks if they'd like to share with this. From Mary, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, or Marie, if I'm saying it incorrectly, please correct me. I do resonate with this, and I think much of this is due to your role as an executive director, because it doesn't feel appropriate to expect the same level of support from your staff, and there are not similar positions to mine on campus, so it can often feel a bit lonely. Yes, absolutely. Ditto times a million. I think one of the things that I'm particularly experiencing in my professional role is we are a new division. And so a lot of times when you, Marie, gotcha. Okay. Thank you. I'm so sorry for that. And I think that when you are doing anything new, when you're in a new structure, I think a lot of our campuses are in this weird space of trying to reimagine again what life looks like intra and post pandemic. And a lot of times when you don't have a model to go by and you don't have someone to say, okay, how are you doing it, or what does that look like, we take on this pressure of, I need to have the answers. I need to figure this out. And it's my responsibility as a part of me being selected to be this leader or this person to do that. And so I think that we aren't always aware of how that can contribute to burnout as well. So thank you so much for sharing that, Marie. Pat, thank you for sharing. We have just gone through a large change of our particular office. For much of the time, I couldn't even share the information. Look, I caught you. I picked up what you were putting down, Pat. I couldn't even share the information and changes with those in my office, and you've come out of the other end very burned out. Being isolated in change. Thank you so much, Pat, for bringing that up. Is another thing that can contribute to our burnout. And again, the tricky thing about burnout is that a lot of the times, by the time that we realize that, oh, this may be beyond tiredness, beyond sadness, beyond exhaustion, this may be burnout. A lot of times we have gotten a lot further than what we might have realized. So, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to go to our next statement. My daily environment contributes negatively to my sense of burnout. Again, this could be a work environment, but I kept it intentionally broad because it could be something that's beyond work. We are more than our positions, we are more than our jobs. So I wanted to keep it intentionally broad. So, is there anyone who'd like to share how this statement resonates with them? If it does. Okay. So, yep. Looking at some things in the chat that are coming up. All right, thank you, Ellie. I hope that I'm saying your name correctly. Please correct me if I'm not. So your institution downsized a little bit and went from 4 assistant directors to 2 of them. So yes, expecting, sometimes our positions are expecting us to do more with less. I'm pretty sure I'm preaching to the choir, especially with housing professionals. And again, thinking about the great awakening that's happening in our field. A lot of that is leaving us to have to do a lot more work with a lot less. And not only is that contributing to your resource of a declining your resources, but also thinking about you as a human and as a resource for your position. That can definitely contribute negatively and accelerate the path to burnout. Thank you so much for sharing that. Is there anyone else who'd like to share either in the chat, or would you like to come up? Yes. So if you'd like to respond anonymously, we figured out in Q&A you can do that. So those are some things that I won't necessarily read out. I'll just kind of say those. I'll keep those to myself, but it'll be so that you can share. For Mike, thank you. So you're on year 9 of a live-in role, and it resonates because you're in the middle of a job search and looking at the live-off roles, but the free housing, yes, aspect of some mid and upper level roles is definitely hard to turn away. I think that's a very, very common piece. I think the live in, it comes with so many benefits, but at the cost of access, at the cost of making it a bit more difficult to figure out how can I separate and create clear lines of separation from work. And again, not being able to have those boundaries and not being able to really carve out what that looks like for you absolutely contributes to burnout. One thing that you'll find, all of the research shows that particularly professionals who are in the helping profession are more at risk for burnout. I think we've seen that more than anything in the pandemic with our healthcare professionals, with our student affairs workers, our teachers. Anyone who is in the helping profession is especially vulnerable to experiencing burnout in all realms. And so we'll talk a little bit about it. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to choose a new profession, but we'll talk a little bit about what that means to think of how can you recognize burnout? How do you kind of identify where you are on the spectrum of burnout? We'll get to that part. So I'll leave that there for now. Okay, and then our last statement for folks to share. I feel that my supervisors are just as burnt out as me and my other colleagues. So if you'd like to share in the chat, if you want to share anonymously, we figured out that you can do that under the Q&A tab. And then if you'd like to come up and share your perspectives, you're welcome to do that also. I feel that my supervisors are just as burnt out as me or my other colleagues. Awesome. So we've at least gotten some folks who've shared that they do see that. I can share personally as other folks decide if they'd like to share or not. I think that my supervisor, what I assume, and again, I know that I'm making an assumption. I assume that my supervisors that are at a higher level than I am are definitely just as burnt out, if not more burnt out than I am, but I don't know that they feel that they have the space to safely express that. And depending on what some of your positions are, that might be the position that you're in. If you don't necessarily feel that you have the space to express how burnt out and how much you actually feel like you might be towards your limit and in how you're feeling. So that might be another place where we're seeing this. So okay, awesome. Other things you can see that. So thank you again, Mike. You can see that we've reached the limits of care, and it makes you hesitate to share because, yeah, you're lucky to also have built a strong relationship pre-pandemic. And you brought up a really great point, Mike, that I'd like to kind of add in, and it relates to a meme I saw earlier on social media. Sharing that you're tired does not mean that we're not grateful. And sharing that you're tired doesn't necessarily mean that we are complaining. And so I think that for me was very liberating in the sense that I can also be really grateful, still really love my job, and also be extremely tired and really needing a break and a reset and feeling like I'm burnt out. Both of those things can coexist at the same time. And I think being able to acknowledge that is really powerful. And then it's really a great first step into thinking about how we can build a healthier balance in what our life looks like. Okay, so got some other things in the Q&A. Thank you so much for you all sharing. I hope that this at least gave you a little bit of validation and knowing that what you're feeling is not necessarily something that you're alone in. What I would like to share, and I shared this with the planning committee when we first started talking about some of the pieces that we would go over today in this workshop. The bad news is that there isn't a cure for burnout. I wish that I could tell you that, oh, there's this thing and you can do it and you just won't be burnt out anymore. There's no cure. However, there are methods for minimizing how much of a hold it's having on your daily life. There is a way to prevent you from becoming even more burnout. And there is a way to acknowledge and really rearrange things in your life so that it doesn't negatively impact you in as many aspects as you can. So even though there's no cure, that doesn't mean there's no hope for being able to be released from burnout. So let's just kind of hop in and think through what exactly is burnout. I think similar to several other terms in the mental health arena, they kind of get thrown around fairly casually. Though burnout isn't necessarily a clinical diagnosis, it is a spectrum on the stress syndrome. It's a placement on the stress syndrome spectrum. And so it was coined by Herbert Freudenberger and is defined as a state of physical or emotional exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and a loss of personal identity. And so I think the two pieces that make it very clear in how you can kind of distinguish from, oh, it's just stress, or it's just exhaustion. When we're getting to burnout, this is where you see those two pieces of the reduced accomplishment and the loss of personal identity. Those are the distinguishing factors that let you know that you are closer, or that is not just those things. Burnout is likely coexisting with stress, with major life changes with other additional stressors. But this is how you know that you're probably looking at something that requires a bit more intentional action. When we're thinking about burnout in the context of our work, most research looks at burnout in an occupational workplace setting. So burnout actually probably came from a lot more of the workplace setting, but that's where we see it most often. Other types of burnout that will usually come up are caregiver burnout, parental burnout, but all of them involve helping someone to the point that you have kind of lost the sense of what it means to help yourself. That's the way I think about burnout. And once you've gotten to the point where you aren't seeing yourself, you aren't feeling that you have given a valuable contribution, and you have forgotten who you are outside of all of your responsibilities, that is the way that I say that we're signaling what burnout looks like. Do you all, and if you all at any point want to share, like, oh, that was just a moment for you to think, like, I probably am burned out. I probably have been burned out more than I realize. This is kind of a way to help you distinguish what burnout actually is and what it looks like beyond exhaustion and beyond sadness. So there are 12 phases of burnout that you kind of go through, and they're a little bit of a stepwise kind of phase to be able to distinguish where you are. So the first piece is excessive drive and ambition. This is the first step of this burnout cycle, and this is literally where you are taking on a lot of things. Now, of course, ambition is not a bad thing, but a lot of times this is a recipe to set you up to take on things that when you're in one space, this feels like a great idea. It feels like there's a lot of things that you can feels like there's a lot of things that you can do. And it's common for people who are like starting a new job, starting a new task, creating a new project. But if we start too fast, and instead of taking a very stepwise incremental approach, then a lot of times we're setting ourselves up unintentionally for burnout. And a lot of times we're also accelerating our path to burnout. Pushing yourself to work harder. So once you've taken on these things, you're saying, I'm going to lose 50 pounds in 2 weeks. Um, again, we go back to our very basic things of SMART goals that we work with our students. And if we are not doing that because this ambition is clouded what our realistic capacity is, a lot of times we'll push ourselves to move a lot farther along than we really need to. The next step, once we've taken on these things and we're pushing ourselves to get it done, even though it may or may not be realistic, is we begin to neglect our own needs. How many of you are getting the amount of sleep that you need? How many of you are not eating lunch at your desk? How many of you are, getting in your actual activity? If you are, I really wish I could give you a gold star through the screen, because the reality of most professionals, particularly in housing, who I've talked to, have just not had the time. And the thing that is most challenging about burnout and managing burnout is the time where we have the least amount of time to devote to ourselves, or where we feel that we have the least amount of time to devote to ourselves, is the time where we probably should be doing it the most. It's probably when you're at the most risk for having some type of collapse, not necessarily a physical collapse, but you're going to feel the weight of what you're carrying. And it's going to be a lot more apparent the moment you start to go away from your baseline activities that keep you well. Our next steps, displacement of conflict. So as you're getting deeper into the cycle of burnout, you may notice that you might be a bit more irritable. You're noticing that you might be pushing yourself to the limit. You're having conflicts with colleagues, maybe people who, you might have usually been able to let something slide, but now you're not necessarily able to be as easygoing or be as agreeable. Or you might be internalizing conflict that you might have expressed in a healthier way pre-burnout. So you're noticing like, oh, I can't manage my responses to certain things as well as I would have been able to do before. So those are some very subtle indicators that you are moving a little bit further into the stage of burnout. The next stage, no time for non-work related needs. I think we all can agree that we have been in the place where we're like, we just need to be working around the clock. A lot of times in housing, when you're on call and you're having a program, and then you also are dealing with a personnel issue, all of those things sometimes will suck hours out of your day before you even realize it. And that is another one of those pieces where you, again, are looking at it as obligations, responsibility, but not necessarily, may not necessarily clearly see in the moment how it contributes to your burnout. Denial. Um, this is where you're seeing again all of these things mounting. Instead of taking responsibilities for your behaviors, you might blame others for your burnout. You might say, it's the job, and again, that is not to invalidate that some of those pieces are impacting your burnout. But in this space of being able to manage what's harmful and how do you minimize burnout, it is ultimately our responsibility to have full agency on what that means. Now, that's layered, and I recognize that some of those pieces of being able to advocate for what you need to minimize burnout might come at a cost of making a particularly risky job, having a particularly risky conversation that might impact job security. But I'm of the belief that if you are not well, if you are not whole as a human, you cannot be well or whole as a professional. And so I think that that's a helpful rationalization to have when you're thinking about how to navigate some of those conversations around your mental health and around what you need to be well. The next few spaces, withdrawal. So if you are saying this is just too much, it's not going to get any better, I just have to be in the work. I have to be fully immersed in these responsibilities to the point to where you start to withdraw from friends and other support systems. Now, let me also note that some of these phases can be happening all at the same time. They don't necessarily have to go one by one. You may skip all the way to, to stage 9 before you realize, oh wow, because this was so intense and at such a concentrated time period, a lot of these things happen almost simultaneously. That's also very common with burnout. It can be a very intense and rapid escalation to where we are in our spectrum. Behavioral changes. This is where you again are becoming increasingly irritable. For some folks, that might be aggressive, but the key here is that you'll notice that this might be towards individuals who you would normally treat that way. And so maybe you're like, I love my students, but when you're truly burnt out, you're like, I don't want to take any more meetings with my students. I don't have the capacity to interact with them in the way that I would have normally interacted with them. I have a partner who I don't have the I don't have the desire to be affectionate once I'm home because I'm this deep into burnout. So again, you may see this in the workplace, you may see this in your personal life, and it's just where you notice it, particularly in areas where it wouldn't have normally been that way. Depersonalization. This is where you have gotten so immersed and you feel like you're almost drowning in a sense that you have started to just detach yourself because that takes less emotional labor. So you're like, you know what? I'm going to just pull away from it. I can't control it. It is what it is. This is happening to me. My life is happening to me as opposed to me dealing with it and moving, not necessarily not dealing with it, but as opposed to me controlling the trajectory of what's happening. It's something that's happening to you. So that's where you see this detachment piece where the burnout has become so severe. Now, for these last couple of steps, we're getting to incredibly emergent phases of burnout. Um, a lingering sense of emptiness or anxiety. So this is something that we're noticing has become chronic. Sometimes we'll see people start to engage in other maladaptive coping behaviors that are seeking to feel this sense of emptiness or to calm this sense of anxiety. Sometimes you'll see this in people overeating. A lot of times we may see this in substance abuse. We may see where folks have decided to cope in other ways to numb any of these feelings. And that is where you may start to see particularly more physical negative manifestations of burnout. Um, I don't know. One of my previous positions was in alcohol and other drug outreach. And I don't know that we're honest as a field about some of the struggles that our own colleagues have with alcohol, other drugs, and all types of other addictive behaviors that I believe have a very direct correlation to burnout within our field. And so I think that this is an area that really we have to be mindful of. And if you're noticing that your occasional wine after work has become bottles after work every day for a weekday, you might be looking at a more severe level of burnout than you might have previously acknowledged. And so thinking about how these signals will tell you I'm not at my baseline of wellness. This is not necessarily what I would have normally encountered, and I want to make sure that I'm sensitive to these changes that are happening in my psyche. Depression, life loses meaning and you're beginning to feel hopeless. I think another thing, especially whether we're thinking about how to acknowledge this in ourselves or in our colleagues, if you're noticing that someone who's been really busy, let's say you have a new employee, and all of a sudden you're just seeing a decline. You're not seeing them at the socials anymore. You're not necessarily seeing them socialize or be, their normal self. It's always okay to check in. And I think some people are like, oh, I don't want to cross a boundary. But a simple, how are you really doing, can go a long way when we're thinking about making sure that folks feel seen. Because this isolation piece creeps up around you like this invisible ironclad bubble that a lot of folks don't necessarily realize that they're in until they're this far. And then the final step of burnout is a complete mental or physical collapse. I think that these three steps are likely where we see a lot of people leave the field entirely. That would be my guess, is that these are the times where there hasn't been enough intentional steps in any of the first steps before this to kind of mitigate what might happen, to where once you're at this level of severity and this level of acuity, the only plausible answer is an exit. And so I think this is a helpful spectrum to kind of understand where we might be, where other folks might be, and how we might be able to intervene before it gets to the point of collapse. So I'll pause here to see if anyone has any questions or any kind of feedback about these 12 phases that are helpful for me to expand on, if any. Awesome. Sorry, I wanted to mute because there was clearly an emergency outside. Okay. Alrighty. So I'm glad that these were helpful. I'm glad that these have kind of helped you break down. So now let's think about coping. So we've talked about, yes, these stages can progress extremely quickly, both in ourselves and in others. And one thing to note before, thank you, Pat, for bringing that up. One thing to note about burnout, and when we're thinking about how to identify it, also recognize that if we're in it and we aren't able to identify it in ourselves, it's going to be nearly impossible to identify it in others in a way that is proactive and helpful. So I always tell people, really work very hard on being honest with yourself about where you are and where you are not, and to also internalize the fact that being honest about where you are is not an indicator of failure. That is probably, if you don't hear anything else I say today, and if nothing else rings a bell or feels like it's resonating, being honest about where you are mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually is not an indicator of failure. Being able to say, I just don't have it, does not make you any less worthy of a professional. Being able to say, I need some time to get back to my baseline, does not mean that you are not competent and not deserving of the position, the title, whatever that you hold. If you don't hear anything else I say today, please make sure you internalize that. Because I think that what is happening with burnout, and when we're thinking about how quickly people are going from that stage 1 to stage 12, people are feeling that they're going to be judged for being honest about where they are. And I just think that we have to really work hard at creating spaces for people to be honest about that. So, how do we try to minimize it? How do we try to fix it? Again, there is no one size fits all approach. I always tell people that I like for you to think about it like a buffet. They're all the types of things that people will tell everyone to do. But if you think about it like a buffet, take the parts that work for you, and they may only work for a certain amount of time. Don't be afraid to go back to the buffet and find new things that work for you, for wherever you are, for whatever's happening in that particular period of your life. Take what you need and know that the rest of those options will be there. So I always tell people, think about it like a buffet. Most things with in terms of burnout, strategies that we see are loosely grouped in these two different areas. So we're looking at avoidance-based coping, which are what I keep calling maladaptive behavior. So those are behaviors that you might be doing and they might be soothing, but they're not necessarily positively impacting the issue that you're trying to address. Approach based coping is looking directly at strategies that um, address what we're thinking about in terms of the roots of burnout, the root cause, and they're targeted to really either be cognitive, behavioral, emotional, so that you'll make sure that you can see some type of immediate impact from them. So here are some examples just to kind of help you think about when you're coping and when you're either designing coping strategies for yourself. You might be thinking about how to design coping strategies for your team. You always want to go with approach-based coping. And now that I'm looking at the slide, I probably should have switched the red and the green because you want to do more approach-based as opposed to avoidance-based. But I think it's helpful to talk about avoidance-based coping again, so you can pick up on the behaviors that you might be using unintentionally to soothe some of your symptoms of burnout. So again, avoidance coping is any type of behavioral, cognitive, or emotional activity directed away from a threat as opposed to directly addressing the root cause. So some of the things that might look like avoidance is avoiding actions that might elicit any type of negative emotion. Um, Although I don't necessarily believe inherently that emotions are positive or negative, for the context of this, I'm thinking about painful memories, anger, maybe if there's something that will happen and it's you're saying, oh, it takes me to a place that I don't want to go mentally, physically. It makes me think about this thing, this time period in my life. Whatever that is, for the context of this discussion only, is what I'm characterizing as negative emotions. However, I don't believe that any emotions are positive or negative. They're just emotions. Hesitant to begin new projects or engage in new interactions. Again, when we're talking about how that invisible ironclad bubble of isolation creeps up on you as you are progressing through the stages of burnout, sometimes you are frozen and you are like, I'm so deep in this, I can't even think about what it would look like to start something new, to meet someone new. I I know personally a lot of folks, as they're kind of dealing with the field, can't even fathom dating. Like a lot of us single folks were like, who has time to even think about dating? I'm trying to keep my head above water. I'm trying to just think about how to manage my children, manage my partner, or manage my life. And I don't see how I can introduce anything else into it, even if it is something that I want. So that might be an example of avoidance based coping, not necessarily making times for the things that you want to do or the creative space that you might want to engage in because you're saying, I just don't have the space for that. Avoiding situations that prompt you to compare yourself or your output to others. So when you're burnout, maybe the performance evaluation meeting, they're your annual performance evaluation, probably feels a bit more anxiety provoking than it might have felt had you not been burnt out, because it will trigger these feelings of, I'm not doing enough. I know that I'm tired. I'm not at the output that I would want to be. And so I feel like someone else is going to see that. So sometimes you may want to avoid it altogether, or you're just noticing that you have a really intensified emotional response to that. Shifting more to the types of coping that we want to encourage more of, approach based coping, which is any type of behavioral, cognitive, or emotional activity that is directed toward a threat. So, problem solving, seeking information. So, when we think about the threat, we're thinking, what are the main things that we know are directly contributing to our burnout, and how are we able to think about ways that we might be able to manage that? So, when we're talking about a behavioral change, that could be a habit, a process, a way that you go about completing a task. We're thinking cognitive, you're thinking about how to reframe mindsets, how to think through, how to challenge some of our thinking around a certain thing that might be contributing to that. And then an emotional activity, some of the things that fall into that are maybe mindfulness, meditation, things that will emotionally and spiritually bring you back to a space to where you're able to more clearly think about what you're trying to do. So looking for the positive side of a situation is an example. I am always a silver lining person, but I also recognize that that is not always a time and a place for that. So if it's a space where it doesn't feel insensitive to look at a positive side of the situation or invalidating, then I think that this could be a helpful thing even for yourself or for others, not in a minimizing way. So let me give an example. Let's say that we're saying, oh, I just lost my job. Is helpful to both acknowledge and also present a side that might be helpful if that's appropriate. So it's helpful to say, I can't imagine how upsetting it might be that to lose something that important to you. I hope that this gives you space to find something else that will give you that same level of fulfillment. So that's kind of a way to say, I'm not going to minimize whatever it is that you're experiencing. And also, I hope to offer something that will give you a bit more hope and perspective. Sometimes in the moment, that's not helpful. So it might be one of those things where you can give it later, but just something to think about in terms of for yourself or for others. Utilizing strategies to challenge negative thinking. I always tell people, particularly if you deal with anxiety in combination to burnout as well, um, is always challenging what your anxious brain is trying to tell you with what you know are facts. I um I have all kinds of ways that I try to relate mental health strategies to people. And so I always say that I think about my anxious brain as a hater. My anxious brain doesn't want me to do well. It doesn't want me to flourish. It wants to creep up in all the moments where even if I am doing well, it wants to help me. It wants to make me think that I'm not. And so when I talk about my anxious brain, as this separate entity, it is something that you have to actively and consistently challenge with facts. So if you are having thoughts that are coming up because you're tired and you say, this is one more thing that maybe you made a mistake because you were tired, instead of hitting that with, I always make these kinds of mistakes, I can't do anything right, which is a very easy mindset to slip into. One of the things that you can think about doing is adopting the mantra of saying, you know what, this is one mistake, but I've done a lot of things right. And so I'll be able to recover from this mistake and I'll be okay. The second response gives you a lot more self compassion. It gives you a lot more grace to yourself, and it doesn't keep you in this space of spiraling into self defeat and further perpetuating you and pushing you further down that burnout spectrum. Making lifestyle adjustments to accommodate for trigger management. So, how this is different in the avoidance based coping, for example, instead of saying, oh, I don't want to go by this part of campus because I'm going to see someone who I feel like is going to upset me, right? I don't know, that probably is a very random example, but thinking about how that's something that you can use to accommodate trigger management, as opposed to just changing your route altogether. You can say, you know what, if I happen to run into this person, this is how I'll handle the conversation and then I'll move forward. That way, it doesn't necessarily avoid that trigger that you don't want to necessarily engage with, but it gives you a strategy so that you are not in an immediate sense of, oh my gosh, what do I do? And set off this mini panic. It helps you just be prepared. And the more you have very micro strategies for how you can deal with some of these triggers or different events that will push up some of these feelings for you, it helps minimize that sense of anxiousness and the sense of what do I do in these moments. Having those types of a toolkit of small micro strategies is extremely helpful for preventing burnout from progressing in the long run. It one gives you a sense of agency over your well-being in a way that is not rude, disrespectful, or disempowering. And then it also helps you reprioritize yourself as a whole being who is deserving of care, who is deserving of time, and who is deserving of grace. So again, it just helps you put yourself back first, while also respecting your need to feel worthwhile at work and to feel like you're contributing positively to the environment that you'd like to be in. So I just kind of wrap this up because I like to keep things super simple so that you can kind of think about whenever you feel like you are pushing yourself along the spectrum of burnout and you haven't paused to kind of think about where you are, what's got you there, have you really stepped in to think about it? This kind of helps frame the takeaways that you might need to just kind of be able to build your strategies out from there. So, triggers, knowing your triggers, being aware of what types of events elicit a certain type of emotional response for you, and also having micro strategies for how you might want to reframe or adjust how you respond to certain things. Healthy coping. So, whatever that looks like for you, again, having the buffet mindset. I may be the person who says, I'm going to go for a run, I'm going to journal, I'm going to meditate. I didn't think it was useful to kind of go through all those things because I think you get those thrown at you everywhere. But out of all the options that come to you for thinking about mindfulness strategies or journaling or talking to a friend, peer support groups, for some people, social media, reading, unplugging, the gamut, figuring out which of those pieces work for you for your coping. And again, choosing coping that is more rooted in approach based coping versus avoidance. Rest. It feels so simple, but we deserve it. Rest is not a reward, rest is a right. So I need people to understand that, especially within our field, that you don't have to ask for rest. I know that, and if you are in this place where you have the power to really reorganize structures, we have to really embody the fact that rest is not a reward, it is a right. We are humans who are deserving of rest. We will not function without rest. And so, where are we making spaces for our staff and our colleagues and ourselves to feel empowered to take on the right of rest? If you all aren't familiar, the NAP Ministry is a really amazing platform that I think is doing really great work around liberating mindsets around resting, particularly for individuals with historically marginalized identities. So I think if you look them up on social media at the NAP Ministry, it's an excellent resource that I would highly recommend for lots of folks. And they also do workshops on different campuses as well. We've used them at a previous institution, so the NAP Ministry is a great resource. Exercise, that looks different for everyone, but at least 30 minutes of physical activity of any kind is helpful for releasing the immediate physical, biological impact of stress and of burnout. Adjusting your schedule. We are not superheroes. We're superheroes in our mind, but not in reality. And so we have to think about, how do we make our work more manageable? How do we reprioritize? And how are we doing that from the lens of making sure that we are maintaining our most important resource in the field, which is our human employees. So how do we prioritize their care so that we are able to then do better work? And then delegation. Again, we can't do it all. So this is where we ask for help. This is where we accept help, because that, I think that is more of the piece, is not only asking for help, but accepting help that is offered, and not feeling as if we have to be the ones to do everything. Hopping back to that very first thing that we mentioned, I feel that I have to be everything to everyone, but I don't always get that back. There's a couple of ways to address that. One, knowing that it's not possible to be everything for everyone, but then also creating spaces so that you are inviting in help that might be being offered, or at least asking for it if it's not being offered. And so I hope that this is at least a helpful mnemonic to just kind of think about very simple ways to start your thinking about what strategies could look like for you, for your team, but mostly you personally. I think it's more important to think about you as a person, because then you're able to think more clearly about how to support your team and gradually chip away at what burnout has probably done for morale, for productivity, and just for where you're moving forward in general. So here, this is where I end. I think I'm a little bit over time, so I apologize for that, but I do have time for questions. So anything that you all would like to ask, I think I see one here. Yes, it's so one question. Is it possible to do both types of coping? Absolutely. Um, I am of the belief that there is there are no absolutes in coping, so I don't necessarily think that there's one way to do all things and then there's one way to just, these are hard, like there are no hard yeses and hard nos in coping, right? I think the biggest thing to acknowledge when we think about avoidance based coping versus approach based coping is that there's not too much of one. And are we noticing that there's an imbalance in how we are coping in a way that negatively impacts the way that we're able to carry on our daily lives? So I hope that kind of answers your question, that yes, it is possible to do both. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I would just try not to be absolutely one or the other. Let's see a couple of other questions. Mostly we're just resonating with early comments, but if you have questions, or you can throw them in the chat, you can throw them in the Q&A. You're welcome to unmute and share them with me also. Yes, I thank you. I hope that this was helpful. I hope that it gave you some nuggets to start thinking about how to address burnout.
Hi, Takita. I had a question. Some of us yesterday in a session were talking about, recruitment and, the difficulties that many campuses, if not every campus, is seeing with recruitment for different roles. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, how we, during recruitment and hiring and even onboarding, acknowledge the reality and the real lived experience, and that burnout is something that is potentially not necessarily unavoidable, but something that folks are going to be working against in positions up front. Because I think we're seeing, I would think that we're part of the reason we're seeing difficulties with recruitment is the reality of some of these roles. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Perfect sense. I think, thank you for your question. I think there's a few different things that, one, are important to acknowledge, and then two, are important to kind of plan for. I think the main theme throughout is a sense for increased honesty and transparency around the field and around the positions that we're recruiting for, and around our actual cultures of our offices, not the aspirational cultures of our offices. I think that a lot of us get stuck that because we're recruiting, we're presenting what we thought we were or what we hope to be. But I think it's important to say, this is where we are. It's where there are places where we'd like to go, but here's where we are, and here's where you would enter as a new employee. One of the things so I'll kind of go piece by piece and kind of give some additional things that I've noticed and that are helpful to consider. Job descriptions right now. Depending on who you're hiring, I think what I'm noticing in different generations of professionals is that job descriptions, people are being able to read behind the lines, read behind the fine print of what's in job descriptions. So when we're asking people to be able to work in a fast-paced environment, to them that now signals you're unorganized and you're going to ask me to do things at the last minute. And so there's a new signal now of what that looks like for certain people who are reading really deeply into job descriptions that they might not necessarily have read into it in that way before. Or we're also dealing with what I would assume, I don't have numbers for this, but what I would assume is a greater number of professionals who are leaving harmful environments who have a different lens now, and so they're looking for a different thing in job description. So there are certain pieces that they are looking at as unspoken indicators that this place would not necessarily be structured to be helpful for me. So that's one of those big things of like, be able to work in a fast-paced environment, be able to, work with tight deadlines. And so some of those things signal to them that, will this place prioritize my humanness? So I think thinking through how we present the positions that we're looking for and how do we humanize them, even in beginning at the job description, is really helpful. When we are going through the interview process, I think one thing that we could probably think about differently is being honest about where there will be flux in the position. So I think there's sometimes where we're like, you'll have time to do this, you'll have time to do that. And then you get to your onboarding and you are in back-to-back meetings and you haven't even had a time to conceptualize these things that you talked about in your interview. You haven't even had a time to sit and be creative. So as a recruiter, we should probably ask the questions about, what do you need in order to think through these plans that you're telling me? So for example, something that I ask is, how do you think? And that feels like a very weird question, but how do you think? And most people are like, I don't understand what you're asking me. Like, what does that mean? But, and I give an example. I say, for me, let's say you email me and you ask me a question. I'm not the person who can give you an immediate response. I'm the person who probably needs a day to process and say, okay, I'm sorry, my brain doesn't work that way. So can I have a day? And so my boss is really great about saying, hey, for our meeting tomorrow, can you think about these things? And that way I'll but it's because we ask them, how are you able to do that? If you're thinking about how to accommodate how people naturally work, even in the stress, even in the scope of being able to work in a difficult environment, because you are already aware of what they would need to thrive in an environment that's kind of out of your control, it still prioritizes humanness. Does that make sense? Yeah. So thinking about, how do you think? How do you create? How are you when you're angry? I ask all those questions to people, and not saying that anger is not welcome. I want to know so that I can be able to help build space into your onboarding schedule, into your training, so that you will have space to do that. I had a client that I had an employee that I recently hired who was very adamant about, and she works in mental health, so I think this is probably why she was really clear about it. But she needs 2 spaces in her workday for like meditation. She only asked for 15 minutes. I said, it's not a problem. And so in her onboarding, we block off that time. In her interview, we blocked off that time to make sure that she had the space to be in a room so that she can be her best self. It was not hard to say, oh, yeah, you can use my office. This is your break time. You can use that for meditation, and we'll build that into your on campus interview. In your onboarding, I know that you need time. Here's a block. You can use that. And so that I'm intentionally scheduling those things. Even though she has a new role, I told her, I was like, you're coming in at a place where we needed you like 2 semesters ago. So you're going to be expected to kind of do some things pretty quickly. But I'm sorry, my dog is doing something out there. But I think that that's another way that we can make sure that we're prioritizing humanness in our posting and how we're scheduling, and also in how we're training and onboarding employees.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I don't know if there are any other questions. Sorry, I'm on mute. My dog is having a moment out here. But I'm happy to answer any additional questions. And if not, you're also welcome to email me. Please do the evaluations. Again, thank you all so much. I hope that we're able to connect. I know what it is. My mom's caretaker just arrived, and so she's barking at my mom's caretaker. But he came a little early, so she's a 5-pound terror, if you can hear, and she is trying to make sure that she's protecting me outside of my room. So yes. Great, Roy. I'm so happy that this was helpful. Thank you all so much. I'm going to go check on my dog. But I appreciate you all, and I hope that you all are able to connect. Please feel free to share anything that was helpful with me, and find me on LinkedIn.